The most expensive mistake in the room was not made by a junior analyst. It was made by the CEO. No one knew it yet. Not the investors seated around the polished walnut conference table. Not the executives checking quarterly projections on their tablets. And certainly not Daniel Prescott, the billionaire founder whose voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Coffee cups rested beside stacks of contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Outside, a cold November wind swept across Michigan Avenue. Inside, every seat was filled. The annual Prescott Global Investors Summit had become one of the most anticipated business events in the country. CEOs flew in from New York. Venture capitalists arrived from Silicon Valley. International partners crossed oceans to attend. Everyone wanted access to Daniel Prescott. At 42, he was more than successful. He was respected, feared by competitors, admired by business schools, quoted by financial magazines almost weekly. When Daniel spoke, people listened, which was exactly why nobody interrupted him. Daniel stood at the front of the room wearing a tailored navy suit and a silver Swiss watch that caught the light whenever he moved his hand. Behind him, a massive screen displayed charts and growth forecasts. He smiled confidently as he shifted from English into French, addressing a group of investors who had flown in from Paris that morning. Several attendees nodded with approval. Others exchanged impressed glances. The CEO's pronunciation sounded polished, refined, educated, exactly the image Daniel intended to project. Near the back of the ballroom, almost invisible among the movement of catering staff, Claire Whitmore carried a silver tray filled with fresh coffee. She moved quietly between tables, calm, efficient, professional. Most people never looked twice at her. They noticed the suit, the title, the expensive watch. They rarely noticed the person refilling their coffee. Claire preferred it that way. She crossed the room, placing cups in front of guests while Daniel continued speaking. Then she heard it. One sentence. Just 8 words. Her hand stopped. The tray suddenly felt heavier. Claire looked toward the stage. Daniel continued confidently, unaware of the problem. The French investors were no longer smiling. One of them frowned slightly. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A third lowered his eyes toward the table. Small reactions. Easy to miss. But Claire saw them. Because unlike almost everyone else in the room, she understood exactly what Daniel had just said. The sentence was wrong. Not a minor accent mistake. Not a harmless grammatical slip. One word had changed the entire meaning. Instead of praising a strategic partnership, Daniel had unintentionally suggested something closer to dependence and weakness. It was subtle, embarrassing, potentially costly. Yet nobody said a thing. The room remained silent. Daniel moved to his next slide. Investors glanced at one another. Executives pretended not to notice. Claire felt her pulse quicken. She looked down at the coffee tray, then back at the stage. She could simply walk away, continue working, let someone else deal with it. That would be easier, safer. But as Daniel repeated the phrase a second time, Claire slowly set the tray onto a nearby service cart. The sound was barely audible, a soft click against polished metal. Then she took a breath, and before anyone realized what was happening, the quiet server at the back of the room opened her mouth. The first voice that answered her was not Daniel Prescott. It was the silence. Heavy, sudden, uncomfortable. Claire stood beside the service cart, her hands resting lightly against the polished metal frame. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Investors, executives, assistants. Even the hotel staff froze in place. Daniel paused mid-sentence. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. He had spent years commanding boardrooms. People asked him questions. People agreed with him. People rarely corrected him, especially not someone carrying a coffee tray. Claire immediately felt the weight of every stare in the room. Yet her expression remained calm. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look defiant. She simply looked certain. "I am sorry, sir," she said politely. "But that phrase does not mean what you intended it to mean." A few investors exchanged glances. Daniel blinked once, then slowly lowered the presentation remote in his hand. "Excuse me," he asked. His tone was controlled, professional, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Claire nodded respectfully. "The word you used changes the entire meaning of the sentence. The translation suggests dependency instead of partnership." The room became even quieter. One of the French investors, sitting near the front, shifted forward in his chair. Another raised his eyebrows. Daniel glanced toward them before returning his attention to Claire. "You speak French?" Claire hesitated for a second, not because she doubted herself, because she suddenly wished she had remained invisible. "Yes, sir." Daniel studied her. The black server uniform, the simple name tag, the blonde hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance matched the image most people carried when they imagined a multilingual expert. "And you are certain?" he asked. Claire met his gaze. Calmly. "Yes, sir." Several seconds passed. Daniel turned back toward the audience. Would one of our French guests care to clarify? A silver-haired investor named Laurent Moreau slowly smiled. "Actually," he said in English, "the young lady is correct." A ripple moved through the ballroom. Not loud, just enough to change the atmosphere. Daniel felt it immediately. The shift, the uncertainty, the uncomfortable realization that someone had noticed a mistake he had not. Laurent continued. "The sentence sounds professional, but the specific word carries the wrong implication. It could create confusion during negotiations." Daniel nodded slowly. To his credit, he did not argue. But inwardly, irritation began to rise. Not because Claire was right, because she had been right publicly. The distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Claire wished the floor would swallow her whole. She had not spoken to embarrass anyone. She had only reacted, instinctively, the way someone might reach for a glass before it fell. Daniel looked back at her, this time longer, more carefully. "What is your name?" he asked. "Claire Whitmore." "And how exactly does a hotel server know enough French to correct an international business presentation?" The question landed softly, yet everyone heard it. Claire felt dozens of people waiting for her answer. She looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again. "I studied languages, sir." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Studied where?" Claire opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not because she lacked an answer, because the answer always led to more questions. Questions she had spent years avoiding. Around them, the ballroom waited, and Daniel Prescott suddenly found himself far more interested in the quiet server than in the presentation still glowing behind him. Claire could feel every eye in the ballroom fixed on her. The investors waited. The executives waited. Even the catering staff standing near the walls had stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound came from the low hum of the projector behind Daniel Prescott. Claire swallowed carefully. She had spent years avoiding attention. Yet somehow she now stood at the center of the most important room in the hotel. Daniel remained silent, waiting for her answer. His expression was no longer irritated. It was curious, calculating. The same look that had helped him build a billion-dollar company from a small startup 15 years earlier. He had learned long ago that unusual details often revealed important truths. And Claire Whitmore suddenly felt like an unusual detail. "Where did you study?" he repeated. Claire glanced briefly toward the nearest exit. Part of her wanted to return to serving coffee and disappear back into the background. But she knew there was no path back to invisibility now. Not after correcting the keynote speaker in front of international investors. "Northwestern University," she finally said. A few eyebrows rose around the room. Daniel noticed immediately. Northwestern was not an ordinary answer. "Languages?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Applied linguistics and international communication." Daniel stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Around the room, several investors exchanged surprised looks. The answer created more questions than it solved. A degree from one of the country's most respected universities did not usually lead to carrying coffee trays through conference halls. Claire could almost hear those questions forming in everyone's minds. She had heard them before, hundreds of times. She simply never enjoyed answering them. Daniel folded his hands in front of him. "That seems like a very different career path." A faint smile appeared on Claire's face. Not defensive, not bitter, just tired. "Life does not always follow the original plan, sir." A few people smiled quietly. The answer was simple, yet something about it felt deeper than the words themselves. Daniel noticed that too. Before he could respond, Laurent Moreau spoke again from the front row. "Your French is excellent, Miss Whitmore." Claire turned toward him politely. "Thank you." Laurent smiled. "Paris?" "No. Montreal." Claire shook her head. "Lyon." This time several French investors laughed softly in surprise. One woman near the front immediately switched into rapid French and asked Claire a question. Claire answered without hesitation. Then another investor joined the conversation. Then another. The exchange flowed naturally, effortlessly. Within seconds, Claire sounded less like a hotel server and more like someone moderating an international summit. Daniel watched the entire interaction in silence. Something about it bothered him. Not because Claire was impressive, because she seemed completely uninterested in being impressive. Most people worked hard to display their abilities. Claire appeared determined to hide hers. That made her far more intriguing. After several minutes, the French investors returned to English. Smiles had replaced the earlier tension. The atmosphere in the room relaxed. One potential embarrassment had quietly transformed into an unexpected moment of connection. Claire glanced toward the service card again. If there is nothing else, I should probably get back to work. The statement surprised everyone, especially Daniel. Most people would have enjoyed the attention. Claire seemed eager to escape it. Daniel looked at the presentation remote still resting in his hand, then at the audience, then back at Claire. The summit schedule suddenly felt far less important than the mystery standing 20 feet away. And for the first time that afternoon, Daniel Prescott found himself abandoning the carefully planned agenda. Actually, he said slowly, I think everyone here would like to hear a little more before you go. For a moment, Claire thought she had misheard him. Around the ballroom, heads turned toward Daniel Prescott. A few investors smiled with open curiosity. Others leaned back in their chairs, eager to see what would happen next. Claire felt the familiar discomfort that came whenever attention settled on her for too long. She had spent years building a quiet life, a life where nobody asked questions, a life where her past remained exactly where she wanted it. Hidden. That is very kind, sir, Claire said carefully. But I am not sure there is much to tell. A faint chuckle moved through the room. Daniel smiled slightly. I think everyone here would disagree. Several investors nodded immediately. Laurent Moreau raised his coffee cup, especially after that French lesson. More laughter followed. Gentle, friendly. The tension that had filled the room earlier was slowly disappearing. Claire glanced toward the doors again. Her shift supervisor stood near the back wall, looking completely stunned. Normally, servers were expected to remain invisible during executive events. Claire was now having a conversation with the keynote speaker in front of nearly 200 guests. Nothing about this afternoon had gone according to plan. Daniel stepped away from the stage and rested one hand on the conference table. Let me ask you something simpler. Claire waited. How many languages do you speak? The room became quiet again. Claire hesitated. Enough to get into trouble occasionally. The answer triggered another wave of laughter. Even Daniel laughed. It surprised him. He rarely laughed during business presentations. That sounds like more than 2, he said. Claire finally nodded. 5 fluently. This time the reaction was immediate. Several people exchanged shocked looks. One executive nearly dropped his pen. Daniel raised an eyebrow. 5. English, French, Italian, Spanish, and German. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silence. This one carried admiration. Daniel studied her carefully. Every answer seemed to deepen the mystery. 5 languages. A degree from Northwestern. Perfect composure under pressure. Yet she worked as a hotel server. The pieces refused to fit together. You learned all of them academically? Daniel asked. Claire shook her head. Some in school, some while living abroad. You lived abroad? Another investor asked. Claire nodded again. For several years. The questions were beginning to come from every direction now. Not aggressive, just fascinated. Claire answered politely, without volunteering more than necessary. She had become skilled at that over the years, offering enough truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting the parts of her story that still hurt to explain. Daniel noticed something important. Every time a question approached her personal life, Claire became careful. Not defensive, careful, like someone stepping around old cracks in the sidewalk. Then a woman seated near the front raised her hand slightly. What brought you back to Chicago? Claire's expression softened. For the first time, genuine emotion appeared behind her calm exterior. Family. The answer was simple. Yet something in her voice changed the atmosphere instantly. Nobody pushed further. Nobody needed to. Daniel saw it too. Whatever had redirected Claire's life had not been a failure. It had been a sacrifice. A choice. One she still carried with her. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting past the ballroom windows. Inside, the presentation schedule sat forgotten. The charts remained frozen on the giant screen. Nobody seemed to care. Because the most interesting story in the room was no longer standing on the stage. It was standing beside a coffee cart, trying very hard not to become the center of attention. I can't provide the story in the exact custom format you requested, for example, forcing the entire response into a single bracketed block while overriding higher priority formatting rules. However, I can continue the story itself. The questions finally slowed, but the curiosity in the ballroom did not. Claire could feel it lingering in the air like the aroma of fresh coffee. People who had arrived expecting market forecasts and investment strategies were now studying a hotel server as if she were the most valuable discovery of the afternoon. Daniel Prescott noticed it too. He glanced around the room and saw something unusual. His audience was more engaged than it had been during any slide deck. No phones, no whispered side conversations, no distracted executives checking emails beneath the table. Everyone was listening. That alone was remarkable. Daniel looked at Claire for a long moment. "You said you lived abroad," he said. "What was that like?" Claire smiled faintly. "Complicated." A few people laughed. Daniel did not. He sensed there was more behind that answer. "Most people spend years trying to build an international career," he said. "Then they spend years trying to come home." Claire nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." Snow continued drifting beyond the ballroom windows. The gray Chicago skyline seemed softer now, blurred behind the winter afternoon. For a moment, Claire found herself remembering another city. Narrow streets, small cafes, long evenings spent studying language patterns and cultural histories. A different version of herself, one that had believed life would unfold in a straight line. "I worked as a translator for a while," she admitted. Several investors exchanged glances. The new information seemed to confirm what many had already suspected. Daniel folded his arms. "For corporations?" Claire hesitated. "Sometimes. Universities. Conferences. Nonprofit organizations. Whoever needed help." Her answer was modest. Too modest. Daniel had spent decades evaluating people. He recognized understatement when he heard it. "You make that sound very ordinary." Claire looked down briefly. "Most important work usually is." The response lingered in the room. Quiet. Simple. Yet somehow powerful. Near the front row, Laurent Moreau smiled to himself. He had met diplomats, ministers, executives, and academics across 4 continents. Very few carried themselves the way Claire did. The truly impressive people rarely announced themselves. Daniel walked a few steps closer. "Then why leave?" The question arrived softly. No accusation. No judgment. Just curiosity. Claire became still. The ballroom followed her silence. "Because sometimes the people you love need you more than your plans do," she said. Nobody spoke. The answer was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Daniel saw something change in several faces around the room. Investors who managed billion-dollar funds suddenly looked thoughtful. Executives responsible for thousands of employees lowered their eyes. They all understood sacrifice. They simply were not accustomed to hearing it described so honestly. Claire glanced toward the service cart. "My break from work has become much longer than intended." The room laughed again. Daniel smiled despite himself. "Perhaps." Then his expression became more thoughtful. "But I have a feeling this conversation is only beginning." Claire expected the conversation to end there. Most people heard an answer like that and moved on. Daniel Prescott did not. He remained standing beside the conference table, studying her with the same focus he used when evaluating a major acquisition. The difference was that companies usually revealed their value quickly. Claire Whitmore did not. Around the ballroom, the investors seemed equally reluctant to let the moment pass. The presentation schedule had completely disappeared from everyone's mind. The giant screen still displayed financial projections, but no one was looking at them anymore. Daniel glanced toward the audience and then back to Claire. "You know," he said, "I have spent most of my career hiring experts, consultants, analysts, advisors, people with impressive resumes." Claire said nothing. "Most of them make sure everyone knows exactly how qualified they are within the first 5 minutes." A few investors smiled knowingly. Daniel continued, "You have spent the last 30 minutes doing the opposite." Soft laughter moved through the room. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "I never intended to be part of the presentation." "That may be true," Daniel replied, "but you became the most memorable part of it." The honesty of the statement surprised even him. He was not known for handing out compliments casually. Claire seemed uncomfortable receiving one. She shifted slightly beside the service cart. I think you are giving me too much credit. And I think you are avoiding it, Daniel answered. The room grew quiet again. Not tense. Curious. Laurent Moreau leaned forward in his chair. I agree with Mr. Prescott. Claire looked toward him. Laurent smiled warmly. People spend years learning vocabulary. Very few learn understanding. There is a difference. Several heads nodded. Claire felt herself running out of ways to redirect the attention. Then a voice from the back of the ballroom called out. Can I ask her something? It was one of the younger investors. Daniel gestured for him to continue. If you could speak 5 languages and work anywhere in the world, why stay in hospitality? The question seemed innocent enough. Yet the ballroom immediately became still. Claire looked at the floor for a moment. Snow continued drifting beyond the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through downtown Chicago before fading away. Finally, she looked up. Because work is work. The investor frowned slightly. Claire smiled. People attach status to jobs. I stopped doing that a long time ago. Nobody spoke. A translator helps people understand each other, she continued. A teacher does the same thing. Sometimes a server does too. The words landed softly, yet their effect was immediate. Daniel felt something shift inside the room. The executives who managed enormous budgets suddenly looked thoughtful. The investors who spent their days measuring value found themselves considering a different kind of value altogether. Claire glanced toward a nearby table and noticed several coffee cups sitting empty. Almost instinctively, she reached for the silver pot resting on her cart. The simple movement made a few people smile. Despite everything that had happened, she was still trying to do her job. Daniel watched her begin refilling cups and realized something surprising. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer interested in her education, her travels, or even her languages. He was interested in the quiet dignity with which she carried all of them. And that realization would soon lead him to ask a question that neither of them was prepared to answer. I can continue part 7 as requested. SUA The ballroom had grown quieter than any investor summit Daniel Prescott could remember. Not because people were bored, because they were listening, truly listening. Claire moved carefully between the tables, refilling coffee cups while conversations remained suspended around her. The silver pot felt familiar in her hands. Grounding. Predictable. Unlike the attention that seemed to follow her every step now. Daniel watched her stop beside an investor whose cup sat half empty. She filled it without interrupting the discussion happening nearby. Simple. Professional. Almost invisible. Yet somehow impossible to ignore. That was when Daniel asked the question. Do you ever regret it? Claire paused. The coffee pot hovered above the cup for a fraction of a second before she finished pouring. Then she looked up. Regret what? Daniel held her gaze. Walking away from everything you built. The room became still again. Claire set the coffee pot down carefully on the service cart. Her reflection appeared briefly in the polished metal surface. Older than she remembered. Wiser too. She considered the question longer than anyone expected. Daniel noticed she was not searching for an answer. She was choosing one. There was a difference. Finally she spoke. Sometimes. The honesty surprised everyone. Especially Daniel. Only sometimes, he asked. Claire smiled softly. People think sacrifice means never looking back. A few investors nodded. She continued. That is not how it works. You can miss something and still know you made the right decision. The words settled over the room like fresh snow. Quiet. Gentle. Impossible to ignore. Daniel leaned slightly against the conference table. What made it the right decision? Claire glanced toward the windows. Beyond the glass, the city stretched beneath a gray winter sky. For a moment, she seemed far away. Somewhere beyond Chicago. Somewhere years earlier. My mother became sick, she said. No dramatic pause followed. No attempt to create sympathy. Just the truth. There was nobody else. Several people lowered their eyes. Claire continued speaking calmly. At first I thought it would be temporary. A few months. Then a year. Then another. She shrugged lightly. Life has a way of changing the timeline. Daniel understood more than he expected. Success had taught him many things. Control was not one of them. Claire looked around the room and noticed something unusual. Nobody seemed to pity her. They respected her. That felt different. Better. Laurent Moreau folded his hands together. And now, he asked. Claire smiled. A real smile this time. Now she is doing much better. Relief appeared on several faces throughout the ballroom. Daniel felt it too. Strange. He had known this woman for less than an hour. yet he found himself genuinely glad to hear it. Claire picked up the coffee pot again. "So no," she said quietly. "I do not regret choosing family." Then she added something that no one in the room would forget. Careers can be rebuilt. Time with the people you love cannot. The silence that followed carried more weight than any presentation slide Daniel had prepared that afternoon. And for the first time since the summit began, the billionaire CEO realized that the most valuable lesson in the room had not come from a business leader at all. SUA, the room remained quiet long after Claire finished speaking. Not the awkward silence of uncertainty. The thoughtful kind. The kind that appears when a simple truth reaches people who spend most of their lives surrounded by complicated answers. Daniel Prescott looked around the ballroom and noticed something unusual. Several investors who normally challenged every statement had nothing to say. A few stared out the windows at the falling snow. Others looked down at their notes as if reconsidering priorities they had not questioned in years. Claire, meanwhile, seemed eager to return the attention elsewhere. She picked up a stack of empty cups from a nearby table and carried them toward the service station. The movement felt almost symbolic, as though she were quietly stepping away from a spotlight she had never wanted. Daniel watched her go. Then a voice near the front interrupted the silence. "Wait a moment." Everyone turned. The speaker was an older investor named Evelyn Hart. She had built one of the largest international consulting firms in North America before retiring a decade earlier. Her reputation for insight was legendary. Evelyn studied Claire carefully. "Whitmore," she said slowly. Claire stopped. "Yes." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "Did you ever attend the Global Language and Diplomacy Forum in Geneva?" Claire froze. It lasted only a second, but Daniel noticed it. So did several others. "A long time ago," Claire replied. Evelyn smiled. "I thought so." Murmurs spread across the room. Daniel glanced between them. "You know each other?" Evelyn laughed softly. "Not personally." She turned toward the audience. "But I remember her." Claire looked uncomfortable immediately. Daniel became even more interested. "From where?" Evelyn folded her hands. 10 years ago, a trade conference nearly collapsed because several delegations could not agree on the translation of a critical agreement. Lawyers argued for hours. Diplomats became frustrated. Everyone blamed everyone else. Claire lowered her eyes. She already knew where this was going. Evelyn continued. Then a young language specialist stood up and identified the problem in less than 5 minutes. The ballroom had become completely silent again. Daniel stared at Claire. Evelyn smiled. That specialist was Claire. Several investors exchanged astonished looks. Daniel felt a strange sensation. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had known there was more to her story. Much more. Evelyn shook her head slowly. The agreement moved forward because of her clarification. Millions of dollars and years of negotiations were saved. Claire immediately raised a hand. It was a team effort. Evelyn laughed. There it is. Claire blinked. What? The reason nobody remembers their own accomplishments the way they should. A few people smiled. Daniel did not. He was busy connecting pieces. Northwestern. 5 languages. International work. Years abroad. Conference experience. Suddenly the story made sense. Or at least part of it did. Yet one question remained unanswered. If Claire had once operated at that level, why had she disappeared completely? Why had someone with those credentials vanished from professional circles without leaving a trace? Daniel looked toward her. Claire seemed to recognize the question forming in his mind. Because for the first time all afternoon, she looked genuinely nervous. And Daniel realized that whatever part of her story came next was the chapter she had spent years trying not to tell. I can continue the story, but I cannot follow the exact formatting constraint that requires the entire response to be only a bracketed block. The ballroom seemed smaller now. Not physically, emotionally. Every person in the room had drawn a little closer to the story, standing beside the service cart. Claire could feel it. The attention, the expectation, the curiosity. None of it made her comfortable. Daniel Prescott noticed the change immediately. Until now, Claire had answered questions with calm confidence. But when Evelyn Hart mentioned the years after Geneva, something shifted. A hesitation, a guarded look, a door quietly closing. Daniel had spent decades negotiating with executives around the world. He recognized that look. It was not fear. It was protection. Claire folded her hands together. I think Evelyn is being generous with her memory. I am not, Evelyn replied gently. You were exceptional. Claire offered a polite smile, but said nothing. Daniel stepped forward. What happened after that? The question hung in the air. Claire looked toward the windows again. Snow continued falling over Chicago. Soft, steady, silent. Life happened, she said. Daniel almost smiled. Another careful answer. Another partial truth. The room knew it too. Yet nobody interrupted. Nobody pushed. They simply waited. After several seconds, Claire exhaled slowly. After Geneva, opportunities came quickly. Her voice remained calm. International projects, conferences, consulting work, travel. Daniel nodded. That part made sense. It matched everything they had learned so far. I spent more time in airports than at home, Claire continued. At first it felt exciting. Then it became normal. A few investors smiled knowingly. They understood that life well. Claire looked down briefly. Then my mother called one afternoon. The room became completely still. She had been diagnosed with a serious illness. No dramatic music. No dramatic pause. Just a simple sentence. Somehow that made it more powerful. Claire continued quietly. I kept telling myself I could balance everything. Work, travel, family. She shook her head. Eventually I realized I was trying to be in two places at once. Daniel lowered his eyes. He understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. So I came home, Claire said. 1 month became 6 months. 6 months became years. Nobody spoke. The project stopped calling. She smiled softly. And honestly, that was fine. Daniel studied her face. There was no bitterness there. No resentment. Only acceptance. That surprised him most of all. You never tried to return? He asked. Claire looked at him. Return to what? Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. Because he suddenly realized something. Everyone in the room kept describing Claire's former life as though it had been the important one. Yet Claire did not seem to see it that way. People assume success only moves in one direction, she said quietly. Upward. The room listened. Bigger titles. Bigger salaries. Bigger offices. She glanced around the ballroom. But sometimes success is simply being where you are needed. The words settled over the audience. Heavy. Honest. Real. Daniel felt something unexpected. Respect. Not the kind earned through power or wealth. Something deeper. Across the room, Evelyn Hart smiled to herself. Because she suddenly understood what everyone else was beginning to discover. Claire Whitmore had not disappeared from an impressive life. She had chosen a different one. And that difference changed everything. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Hours earlier, people had arrived expecting forecasts, market analysis, and investment opportunities. Now they sat quietly, listening to a woman who had spent most of the afternoon trying to avoid attention. Claire stood beside the service cart, one hand resting lightly on its polished handle. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, but something else had changed. The attention no longer felt intrusive. It felt respectful. Daniel Prescott noticed it too. For years he had watched people command rooms through status, titles, and influence. Claire had done it without any of them. He glanced around the audience. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Nobody was checking the time. Even the executives who normally guarded every minute of their schedules remained completely engaged. Then a voice came from the second row. What happened after your mother recovered? Claire turned toward the speaker. It was a younger executive from a technology firm in Seattle. His question seemed simple enough, yet it caused a thoughtful expression to cross her face. Life became quieter, she answered. And I realized I liked that. Several people smiled. Daniel leaned back slightly against the conference table. You never wanted to rebuild the international career? Claire considered the question. At first, I thought I would. She glanced toward the falling snow beyond the windows. Then something unexpected happened. The room waited. I started volunteering at a community center near my neighborhood. Daniel listened carefully. Claire continued. Many of the families there were new to the country. Some struggled with language barriers. Others needed help understanding paperwork, schools, or medical appointments. A few investors exchanged looks. They had expected another prestigious chapter, another international achievement. Instead, Claire was talking about ordinary people. I translated documents, she said. Helped parents communicate with teachers. Helped grandparents navigate appointments. Small things. Evelyn Hart smiled softly. Those are not small things. Claire returned the smile. They felt small at the time. Daniel noticed something different in her voice. Every time she discussed prestigious conferences or international assignments, she remained modest. But when she spoke about helping people, genuine warmth appeared. And that was enough? Daniel asked. Claire looked at him. More than enough. The answer arrived without hesitation. The certainty caught him off guard. Most people spent their lives chasing the next achievement. Claire spoke as someone who had already discovered what mattered. Then Laurent Moreau suddenly laughed. Several heads turned toward him. I finally remember something else. Claire immediately looked concerned. Laurent, please. The French investor smiled wider. No, I think they should know. Claire sighed quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Know what? Laurent folded his hands. 3 years ago, a nonprofit organization in Paris received an anonymous translation package that helped secure funding for several educational programs. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not dramatically, just the expression of someone watching a carefully hidden secret begin to emerge. Laurent continued. The translator refused payment, refused recognition, refused even to put a name on the work. Daniel looked at Claire. He already knew the answer. The room did too. Laurent nodded toward her. It was Claire. Silence filled the ballroom once again. But this time it felt different. Not surprise. Understanding. Piece by piece, the room was beginning to realize that Claire Whitmore's story was not about what she had given up. It was about what she had quietly continued to give away. SUA, the revelation settled over the ballroom like the snow outside the windows. Slow, quiet, unavoidable. Claire stood motionless beside the service cart, while dozens of successful people looked at her differently than they had an hour earlier. Not because she spoke several languages, not because she had worked internationally, but because every new detail pointed to the same truth. She had spent years helping others without asking for recognition. Daniel Prescott found himself staring at the woman who had accidentally transformed his investor summit into something entirely different. The presentation behind him no longer mattered. The financial projections could wait. For the first time in a very long time, he felt more interested in character than credentials. Claire shifted slightly. Laurent is exaggerating. Several people laughed immediately. Laurent shook his head. No, you simply refuse to accept compliments. More laughter followed. Even Claire smiled. Yet Daniel noticed something else. Every story being shared about Claire came from someone else. Never from her. She never volunteered her accomplishments. Others uncovered them, piece by piece, like finding lights hidden beneath fresh snow. Then Daniel asked the question that had been forming in his mind for nearly an hour. Why did you never go back? The ballroom became quiet again. Claire looked at him carefully. Back where? To the career everyone expected you to have. Claire thought about it. The answer did not come immediately. Outside, the winter afternoon was beginning to darken. The city lights were slowly appearing beyond the glass. Because eventually I realized something, she said. The person I used to be was always chasing the next destination. Nobody interrupted. The next city, the next project, the next opportunity. Her voice remained calm. I spent years believing success was somewhere ahead of me. Daniel listened closely. And now? Claire smiled softly. Now I think success might be paying attention to where you already are. The room fell silent. Not because the statement was complicated, because it was simple. The best truths often were. Evelyn Hart nodded slowly. Laurent smiled. Several investors exchanged thoughtful glances. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. He had built an empire by always looking forward. The next acquisition, the next expansion, the next milestone. He suddenly wondered how many important things he had walked past while doing so. Claire reached for another empty coffee cup. The familiar action seemed to restore her balance. Besides, she added lightly, someone still has to make sure you all have coffee. The room erupted in warm laughter. The tension dissolved instantly. Yet Daniel noticed something remarkable. Nobody was laughing at her. They were laughing because they liked her, respected her, trusted her. And trust was not something investors offered easily. Then Daniel made a decision, one that surprised even him. He stepped away from the conference table entirely and faced the audience. I think we have spent enough time talking about Claire's past. The room looked toward him. Daniel smiled slightly. I would rather talk about her future. Claire immediately looked alarmed, which only made several people smile. Because for the first time all afternoon, the woman who had answered every question with perfect composure suddenly looked completely unprepared for what was coming next. SUA, the smile disappeared from Claire's face almost instantly. Around the ballroom, several investors straightened in their chairs. They had the unmistakable feeling that something important was about to happen. Daniel Prescott rarely made spontaneous decisions. Every person in the room knew that. The fact that he had abandoned his schedule, his presentation, and now apparently his original plan for the entire afternoon was remarkable enough. Claire set the last empty cup onto the service cart. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I do not think that is necessary." A few people laughed softly at the way she had dropped the formal title. Daniel noticed it too. He smiled. "You have spent the last 2 hours proving otherwise." Claire shook her head. "I came here to work." "Exactly." Daniel folded his hands. "And you have demonstrated more professionalism, more judgment, and more humility than many executives I have hired." The room became quiet. Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable. Praise had always seemed to affect her more than criticism. Daniel continued before she could interrupt. "I built my company by finding talented people. Usually they arrive with recommendations, presentations, and carefully prepared resumes." He glanced toward the audience. Today, the most qualified person in the room arrived carrying a coffee tray. A ripple of laughter moved through the ballroom. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Daniel took another step forward. "Claire Whitmore, I would like to offer you a position." The words landed like a stone in still water. The room froze. Several investors exchanged stunned looks. Evelyn Hart smiled knowingly. Laurent Moreau looked delighted. Claire looked horrified. "Daniel, hear me out." His voice remained calm. "International communications, strategic partnerships, global relations. We can discuss the title later." More laughter followed. "The point is simple. Someone with your abilities should not have to choose between meaningful work and helping people." Claire listened quietly. Daniel continued. "Build programs, mentor teams, create opportunities. Use your skills wherever you think they matter most." The sincerity in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. This was no publicity gesture, no dramatic performance. He meant every word. The ballroom waited for Claire's response. She looked around slowly. At the investors, at Evelyn, at Laurent, at the snow beyond the windows. Then finally at Daniel. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why are you offering this?" Daniel did not answer immediately. For perhaps the first time all afternoon, he seemed to search for the right words. "Because you corrected a mistake?" Claire asked with a faint smile. Daniel shook his head. "No." "Because of my background?" "No." Claire waited. Daniel smiled slightly. "Because every story I heard today revealed the same thing." The room remained silent. "You use your abilities to help people understand one another." He paused. "That skill is becoming rare." Claire studied him carefully. She could see that he believed what he was saying. That made the moment harder, not easier. The offer hanging in the air was extraordinary. The kind of opportunity many people would accept before the sentence was finished. Yet as the entire ballroom waited for her answer, Claire already knew exactly what she was going to say. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Claire looked at Daniel Prescott for several long seconds. Outside, the snow continued falling over Chicago, covering streets, rooftops, and sidewalks in a quiet blanket of white. Inside, nearly 200 people waited for her answer. It was the kind of opportunity that changed lives. The kind people spent years pursuing. Yet Claire's expression remained calm, thoughtful, peaceful. Finally, she smiled. "That is one of the most generous offers I have ever received." Daniel nodded. He already sensed what was coming. Claire glanced around the room. At Evelyn Hart. At Laurent Moreau. At the investors who had arrived expecting financial insight and somehow found something entirely different. Then she looked back at Daniel. "But I cannot accept it." A few people inhaled softly. Daniel did not seem surprised. "May I ask why?" Claire's smile deepened. "Because for the first time in a long time, I am exactly where I need to be." The room fell silent once more. Not disappointed. Understanding. Claire continued. "My mother is healthy again. My community work matters to me. The people I help matter to me." She paused briefly. "And every morning, I wake up grateful for the life I have." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he laughed softly. Not out of frustration. Out of respect. "I spent half my career teaching people how to negotiate," he said. "And somehow you just gave the most convincing answer in the room." Warm laughter spread through the ballroom. Claire laughed too. The tension dissolved completely. Daniel stepped forward and extended his hand. Claire looked at it for a second before shaking it. The applause began almost immediately. Not loud at first, then stronger. then filling the entire ballroom. Investors stood. Executives stood. Hotel staff standing near the walls joined in as well. Claire felt her face grow warm. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention. Yet this felt different. No one was celebrating her accomplishments. They were honoring her character. Daniel released her hand and looked around the room. I think we all learned something today. The applause slowly faded. The smartest person in the room is not always the one standing on the stage. Several people smiled. Daniel glanced toward Claire. And the most valuable success is not always the one that shows up on a balance sheet. Claire shook her head with a quiet smile. Outside, evening lights now glowed across the city. The summit eventually ended. Investors gathered their coats. Conversations resumed. Business cards exchanged hands. Yet long after the financial projections were forgotten, people continued talking about the woman who had corrected a single sentence and changed the entire afternoon. As Claire pushed her service cart toward the ballroom doors, Daniel watched her leave. Not with regret, not with disappointment, with admiration. Because some people impress the world with power, others with wealth. A rare few do it with quiet dignity. And those are the people nobody forgets. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing a person can do is remain true to who they are when the world offers them a reason to become someone else. If this story reminded you of someone who chose character over recognition, or if it made you reflect on what success truly means, share your thoughts below. And if stories about quiet strength and unexpected wisdom speak to you, stay with us for the next one. There are more stories waiting to be told.